My name is Steve Krapinski. I'm the marketing director with Michigan Radio. Thank you all for coming out on a little bit feels like fall Tuesday afternoon here. Thank you very much. Before we get started and turn things over to our host, Rebecca Williams, I have a couple announcements I wanted to make. First off, if this is the first time you've ever come to one of our Issues and Ale events, these are events that we do every month or two all throughout southern Michigan, designed to discuss issues that are taking place in Michigan, but in kind of a fun and informal atmosphere. So with that in mind, please, a lot of people already have a drink. Feel free to help yourself. It'll help the conversation go along better. And tip your waitresses. We always have to announce that as well. A couple other things I want to let you know. We do want to thank the Great Lakes Fishery Trust for their financial support of tonight's event, and also our on-air series on Asian carp in the Great Lakes that we aired last week on Michigan Radio. If you missed those stories and you want to know more about Asian carp, you can actually go to the Environment Report website at environmentreport.org. Of course, we want to thank Lisa and the staff here at the Kirby House for hosting this event and graciously providing us the venue. Thank you. So, as I said, be sure to eat up. The Asian carp won't last long, so they have a full menu. You can order other things as well. If you enjoy the Asian carp, that is something you can purchase. There is a fish market in Illinois called Schaefer Fisheries that sells all sorts of unusual freshwater fish. This is actually bighead carp, smoked bighead carp you were sampling today, so that is available. A couple other quick announcements. Tonight's event is being videotaped, so when we get to the Q&A portion of the event, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. I'm going to go around with a wireless microphone. We just want to make sure that we can hear your questions and comments and get those on the videotape. And we do also want to let you know, does everyone here have one of our little clickers? Does anyone not have a clicker? Okay, you do. All right, if you don't have a clicker, raise your hand. We'll have someone take one to you. Because we're going to do some audience polling tonight throughout the evening. We're going to ask for your opinion on some issues having to do with Asian carp and invasive species in the Great Lakes. So you want to hang on to those. When we get to those questions, you can just take a look up on the screen up here. The questions will appear. Rebecca will read the questions, and then they're all multiple choice answers. So this is there isn't a right or wrong answer other than, I think, for the first question. So this is just to gauge your opinion on some questions related to Asian carp. And you just punch in the little number that appears on your clicker, 1 through 5. We will be collecting these at the end of the evening, so please make sure either just leave this on your table or give it to one of our staff that's here. These will not work on your flat screen TV, so they really have no value, but they cost us about $25 a piece if we don't collect all these afterwards. So if you leave those behind, we would appreciate it. And last but not least, we will have other Issues and Ale events coming up in West Michigan later on this fall. In fact, we have one coming up in just about a month from now. We're taking a departure from Asian carp, and as we get close to the elections, we're going to be doing a Truth Squad night looking at election and political advertising. That is going to be on Tuesday, October 23rd at Dr. Grin's Comedy Club at the Bob in Grand Rapids. So again, you're going to be seeing a lot of political advertising between now and the election, and we're going to help you try to sort out the fact from the fiction of that at that event on October 26th. So we hope you'll join us then. And if by any chance you're going to be in southeastern Michigan on election night on November 6th, we're going to be doing a special election night viewing party in Ann Arbor. We're going to be at a sports bar watching the election results come in, and we're going to be having some commentary and analysis from some of our political analysts and also some other political pundits. So if you happen to be in Ann Arbor on election night, we hope you'll join us for that. And without further ado, let me introduce you to our host for this evening. Rebecca Williams is a reporter and the host of Michigan Radio's Environment Report, which you can hear every Tuesday and Thursday at 8:50 in the morning and 5:45 p.m. Rebecca is one of those unusual people who is actually able to put her college degree to good use because she has a natural science degree from the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. And in her time, how many years has it been with the Environment Report? 12 years with the Environment Report. She has covered a wide myriad of stories, and everything from hungry water snakes in Lake Erie to coyotes living in suburban Detroit. And she has visited a hibernating black bear in its den, and also people who live in tiny 300 square foot houses, which probably was not much bigger than the size of the black bear den, I'm guessing. So, without further ado, it's Rebecca Williams from the Environment Report.
All right, thank you so much for coming tonight. We're glad to see you all here. First, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Next to me, we have Dr. Carl Reitz. He's an associate professor at Grand Valley State University's Annis Water Resources Institute. He's a fisheries biologist, and most of his research focuses on population and community ecology. And then we have Dr. Tammy Newcomb. She's the research program manager for the fisheries division within the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. And Captain Denny Grenold. He is a charter boat captain. Since 1983, he's been taking people out to fish for Pacific salmon, Chinook salmon, coho, lake trout, and steelhead. He's also the chair of the U.S. Committee of Advisors to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and also the State and Federal Affairs Officer for the Michigan Charter Boat Association. And we'd like to start by asking all of you a question. And this is your quiz. Which of these is an invasive Asian carp? We'll give you a minute to answer. Can you see it? And you can select on your clicker here and vote. Everybody voted? Okay. All right, Steve. Wow, very good. Number 3 is the right answer. Number 4 is a great white shark. Number 1, this is kind of a trick question. Number 1 is a common carp, and they are not native either, but they've been in the United States since the 1800s, and they're pretty much everywhere except Alaska, I believe. Is that right? All right. And then number 2 is a channel catfish. So on the next slide, if you could hit the next slide, Steve. Dr. Newcomb, if you could explain the differences between the 4 species. When we say Asian carp, we're talking about typically these 4 species of concern.
So we talk about Asian carp because these 4 species are from Asia. Common carp are from Europe, so big difference there. They're different, what we call genus, different genus and species. So they actually have different ecological purposes within their fish community. So the bighead and silver carp are the 2 big-headed carps that we're most concerned about entering the Great Lakes right now. Those 2 fish, bighead carp grow to the largest size, about 100 pounds, and then the silver carp themselves can grow up to 60 pounds. Silver carp are the ones that fly out of the water when they're agitated by boat motors, and they've been known to cause a lot of bodily harm and damage. Both of these species are what we call highly fecund, meaning that they can produce millions of eggs, up to 1 million eggs each with each spawning event. So highly fecund, and so they make a lot of young. So grass carp are another Asian carp species that we are also very concerned about. In some of the other states, they allow for triploid grass carp. That means they're genetically modified so that they cannot reproduce, and they use them to manage grass in ponds. The problem with that is that not all of them are always genetically modified. So they will alter food webs by eating all the vegetation, and some vegetation is necessary for fish communities. And then the 4th species, black carp, is another one that we're very worried about. It is coming up the Mississippi River as well, albeit at a much slower pace. But this is a carp species that eats mussels. So zebra mussels, quagga mussels, you could say, oh yay, we have the answer there, but not so good, because we also have freshwater mussels as well, native freshwater mussels. So the big-headed carps eat higher in the water column, and the grass carp eats grass or vegetative plants, and the black carp eats mussels.
Okay, thank you. Can you explain, before you pass the mic to Captain Denny, just one more thing, about bighead and silver carp? They eat plankton, right? So what's the concern for those two species?
So the kinds of food that these fish eat are also the same kinds of foods that our native planktivores will eat. And native planktivores are fish like a little bit of whitefish, particularly in their young life stages, but cisco and chubs. And then the other species that is also an invasive species that's a planktivore is alewife. And as many of you know, alewife are the basis for the food chain for the Chinook salmon fishery. The other issues are near shore. These fish will eat the phytoplankton and zooplankton near shore, and they will compete with and prey upon the larvae and eggs of fish in those near shore areas and coming out of the river. So from a food web perspective, that's why we're very concerned about those fish.
And Steve, if you can hit the next audience question. All right, so we'd like you to, in your opinion, how big of a threat do you think Asian carp pose to the Great Lakes? Severe, moderate, low, or none?
Relative to what?
Zombie apocalypse, I guess?
It's kind of a quick question. I mean, it's got to be relative to something.
It's just your opinion.
Okay.
There's no right or wrong answer for your opinion. Okay? Okay, so most people think severe. So, Captain Denny, could you talk about how would you describe the threat that Asian carp pose to the Great Lakes ecosystems? And
Well, we need to learn a lesson from the sea lamprey. If we don't learn a lesson, we're destined to repeat it. Asian carp come in, we'll be dealing with them for your lifetime, your children's lifetime, and in perpetuity. So it's a major threat.
Carl, could you talk about the particular concerns we have about the fisheries and what fish species might be most impacted?
Well, as Tammy said, the planktivores for sure, and then the one thing to keep in mind is that all larval fish are planktivores, so that that's a way it can affect all fish species. And then some of the ones, though, in particular, I was doing some reading today, a little studying before I came here, and I noticed there was some reports in the literature of walleye and crappie as two species that there's been some data that shows that the larvae of those species, the kinds of niches they occupy in the ecosystem make them particularly susceptible. And it's not clear if it's predation, competition, exactly what's going on, but those might be species in particular that could be affected by the carp. Also, I think it's important to think about where in the lakes they're likely to establish. I think most scientists would agree that it's very unlikely that carp are going to establish in sort of outer Lake Michigan proper. It's likely to occur in the nearshore areas, particularly river mouths and rivers like the Grand River that we're nearby here. Also, lakes, some of the lakes, Muskegon Lake would be another good example of those kinds of systems. They're more productive than Lake Michigan proper. Lots of algae, more nutrients. So those are the kinds of habitats the carp would likely establish. And then the question becomes whether or not there is the reproductive habitat for the carp. And I think that's sort of an open debate among scientists. It's pretty surprising to me how little we actually know about their reproduction. There's some that suggest that they need to have rivers to spawn in, and then the eggs are semi-buoyant, and they need to flow in the water column and turbulent flows to be maintained in the water to hatch. But then there's also been some reports that there's some lakes that it looks like in China or reservoirs where they've reproduced that don't seem to have those types of habitats. So it's not really clear exactly what their reproductive requirements are, but that's definitely going to be an important aspect of whether or not they would establish.
And we've heard a lot about Lake Erie being a spot where carp would probably do very well. Could you talk about that, Tammy, about why carp would potentially do well in Lake Erie?
Well, as Carl mentioned, these fish will do very well in highly productive systems. And right now, Lake Erie is the most productive Great Lake. It always has been because it's so shallow. It's also a bit warmer, and essentially the entire lake provides suitable habitat for Asian carp. It also has several large rivers that these fish could move up into. And so in that type of ecosystem, and that includes up into Lake St. Clair, they're literally unfettered in their ability to just reproduce and take off as an invasive species. Carl mentioned the reproductive habitats, or habits. The thing that we're learning is that these fish adapt very quickly as we've watched them march up the Mississippi and the Missouri and the Illinois rivers and now into the Ohio River Basin. One of the things that they've done is started spawning up to 3 times a year. So not only when they spawn do they spawn in a large abundance of eggs, but they can also spawn more than once a year. So.
Now, Denny, we're coming up on Salmon Week here in Grand Haven, and I know you take people out for charter fishing trips for salmon. Do we know much about what the carp could do to salmon, if anything at all?
What they can do to them?
In terms of the
Well, it would displace
impacts.
them, right, for the most part. And it was mentioned that Lake Michigan proper, there's probably not enough food there. I think in the streams and the rivers and the ground river mouths, will destroy the native species that are in there. They'll destroy spawning habitat for salmon, steelhead in particular, and its economic impact that you really have to look at and regard, just not the charter industry, but the sport commercial fishery in the Great Lakes is worth some $7 billion. $16 billion in the boating industry, not counting the tourism industry. There's 830,000 jobs in Michigan that are directly related to Great Lakes. You've seen your old city here in Grand Haven. I've been here a long time, as maybe some of you have, and you go back 35, 40 years ago, and you see what the fishing, the boating, the activity has created this impact on coastal communities up and down both sides of Lake Michigan, Huron, and so forth. It would have a huge impact economically, would have a huge impact recreationally. We just simply cannot afford another invasive species in the Great Lakes.
So we've heard some claims that are made sometimes, often by politicians, that Asian carp could devastate the $7 billion fishery, and I'm wondering if you all could weigh in on, are we likely to see widespread impacts or impacts on certain species, impacts on certain lakes more than others? We mentioned that probably carp won't do so well in the middle of the lakes, but more so closer to shore.
Well, you probably would see the effect more than likely. I'm guessing that these two are probably better lists than I, but probably maybe Lake Erie. Obviously, the first streams to be impacted would be Carrier Creek down in Indiana. The St. Joe River is a perfect example of habitat for Asian carp, as the Grand River is. Ground river mouths like Lake Macatawa. Try to water ski on Lake Macatawa with silver carp jumping all over the place. That just simply wouldn't happen. So that fishery would be taken and wiped off to begin with, and then there would be nothing much left out here to fish with. Pork.
Would you like to also weigh in on that? Kim?
So people have said, oh, it's not going to have that big of an effect. Every denial is a wonderful thing. And probably true for a while. We get a few fish in, and they're pretty localized, and we're trying to do our best, the DNR, maybe with some help from other folks to try and eradicate them. Might not make such a big impact in the beginning, but as the population grows and spreads throughout the lake, we will start to see their impact. And some of the assessments have been, it might take them 20 years to spread throughout the basin, and 50 years potentially for full colonization. And so will it destroy the fishery all at once? No, it won't destroy it all at once, because there's all invasive species. Their population kind of start out low because they have to find one another to do the love thing, right? Got to do that first. And then once they do, they get the hang of it and they find the habitats. and then they explode. We see this with all invasive species. They explode in their population, so they get to some point where they've exceeded their carrying capacity, and then maybe they'll come back down. But history, as Captain Denny has told us, helps guide us. We believe that only now are we beginning to see the full impact of zebra mussels and quagga mussels and their effects on the Great Lakes and changes in the food web. Only now, 20 years past their introduction. So that's a very important thing to understand, is that we get Asian carp in the lakes day one, the sky won't fall overnight. But it's the legacy that we leave for the future residents of Michigan, for our kids and their kids.
Carl, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure, I would just say that I tend to agree with what Tammy said, and also I would add that with these non-native species, when you add them to the lake, it's really almost impossible to predict what the ecological effects will be. So in my opinion, it's much better to err on the side of caution if you don't know. It's sort of like we need to do the experiment to really find out, and in my opinion, it's an experiment we don't want to do to find out, you know, who's right or who's wrong, because if it turns out they have a big impact, it's going to either, you know, if there are any solutions, they're going to be very expensive. And as Denny mentioned, you know, look at how much money we spend on sea lamprey every year, and we still haven't eradicated them.
If we again go back in history, and you know, we're talking, the Wheeling Canal was opened up, and then subsequently the St. Lawrence Seaway, just about pretty close to the same time the Chicago area waterway system was opened up. So you got these two big barn doors. When sea lamprey first came in through the Wheeling Canal and the Seaway, you know, back then we didn't think much of invasive species. We figured that was a good idea to open up the shipping and so forth. And we discovered the sea lamprey were coming in. From that period, it took maybe 40 years till the 1940s. In that amount of time, indigenous lake trout and whitefish and the lakes were extirpated. So we've had to go in and you know, control the sea lamprey now and rebuild it. So you're correct. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's like we know a lot more now than we did back then. It's like a biological terrorist. We know what they can do, we know where they came from, and they know where they're at. And now's the time to do something with them.
So we see these YouTube videos of jumping silver carp in the Illinois and Missouri rivers, and I'm wondering, is that something that would happen with silver carp throughout the Great Lakes? Do they tend to jump if they're just in rivers? Would that happen in the open lakes?
From everything that I've read and that I've heard folks talk about, it's, you know, Asian carp jump when they're agitated by boat motors. It's not really clear exactly why they do that, but it's when they occur at high densities. So if the silver carp were able to reach high densities, you know, in places like the Grand River or Muskegon Lake or Lake Macatawa or the St. Joe River, yeah, you could expect those kinds of things.
So then also we've heard about, you may have heard about environmental DNA, and it's this way of testing to see if there's evidence of carp in a water body. And I know that you've been involved with that, Tammy. Could you talk about how that works?
So environmental DNA, we all see DNA used for crime scene investigations. Well, environmental DNA is DNA that's collected out in the environment, just like you would do for a crime scene potentially. When fish swim through the water, they shed things. They shed scales, they shed mucus, they shed urine, they shed feces, so on and so forth. And so you can imagine a fish swimming through the water as a car driving down a dusty road. And after the car is gone, you can still see the plume for some period of time. Filter the sample out to get the DNA material off from it. They do something with a special sauce, and then a black box that they throw it into and zap some lights on it, and out on the other side of that black box comes that answer to that environmental DNA. And what we can tell very specifically is if there's the DNA of a bighead carp or a silver carp there. And we can tell that with high certainty. It's a very, very sensitive tool, though.
And so can you talk about how, if you get a DNA, a positive hit, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a live fish, though, right?
Oh, Rebecca, the question. So as a Michigan DNR biologist responsible for managing their fishery now and into the future, and making sure that we don't gamble with that fishery out there, we presume that eDNA does mean the presence of a live fish. We are open to exploring the other options for how environmental DNA or the DNA of those fish got to a particular location. But our position currently is that we have to presume that there's a live fish there. Now we can go out and do a lot of things, a lot of sampling, different types of sampling with nets and electrofishing and those types of gear. It's very inefficient. So think of a needle in a haystack and you got a blindfold on with snowmobile gloves, okay? That's like trying to find a grass carp in the open waters of Lake Erie, or not a grass carp, excuse me, a big head or silver carp in the open waters of the Great Lakes. Very tough to do. But that environmental DNA is extremely, extremely sensitive. So we've kind of got a pinhead over here and a baseball bat over here. And so we have to balance the trade-off between, when we go out and sample and we don't find any fish, does that mean there's not any fish out there when the environmental DNA says there is? No, it doesn't. It means that we weren't able to sample them. There's been other studies that are being done by the Army Corps of Engineers to look at potential vectors. We do know that eDNA can potentially be transferred through bird droppings, potentially. There's still some science on that needs to get done. We do know that eDNA can remain viable in things like ice water or water that's dumped out of trucks carrying Asian carp. So, and then the other thing is carcasses. At fish cleaning stations, somebody cleans an Asian carp, dumps the waste offal back into the water, or off from one of the barges coming through the Chicago area canal, that can leak DNA as well. But I'll leave it there. You'll have questions, I'm sure.
So recently, you may have heard that crews have been out on Lake Erie, and in July they sampled and had 150 samples, is what I read, and then out of those were 20 positive hits for silver carp DNA. So based on what you're saying, it sounds like the working theory is that there are silver carp in Lake Erie.
Well, the interesting thing too is that silver carp and big head carp can hybridize. And so we get silver or big head carp, the eDNA, it could mean that there's one or the other there. And so we did have positive hits, and 2 for silver carp in Sandusky Bay with our first round of sampling. And then we had, as Rebecca said, the 20 hits in Sandusky Bay, that's Ohio waters, but very close to us, for silver carp as well, the second round of sampling. The first round of sampling showed big head carp in Sandusky Bay. So how could that eDNA be there if it's a live fish? Well, up until 2002, it was still legal to have live Asian carp in the food trade, in the food market. After 2002, that's not allowed anymore through the Lacey Act. But there still could be fish. There were 3 fish captured in Lake Erie prior to 2002 that were big head carp. They were all captured by commercial fishermen. All of the evidence suggests that those fish came from the south. They were not a reproducing population in Lake Erie. Because these fish are fast-growing and long-lived, very long-lived fish, it is possible that we still have some residual big head carp in Lake Erie.
So what do you do next? I mean, as an agency, I'm sorry to put you on the spot again, but what do you do next if you think there may be live carp in Lake Erie?
Hard questions tonight. So we need to balance. We need to balance the resources that we have available with the probability of us actually finding a fish out there. Because we could send the entire division. We could send all 40 biologists out there into the lake and all the gear that we have and spend a whole lot of money on this single issue and then not have anything left to manage Captain Denny's Chinook salmon fishery. Probably not a good solution. So we have to balance, and what we're looking at right now is being strategic and thinking about where there are places that we could, if they were found, that we would have a possibility to manage for them or to eradicate them. And that would be in the rivers, where we could potentially contain them and sample them out. And then the second thing is awareness. So angler awareness. These fish really, unless you snag them, you're not really going to catch them because they eat things that are this big. So they just don't take lures like a recreational fish would. So the commercial fishermen, in this case, are our best eyes and ears out there, and both Michigan and Ohio have really geared up with the commercial fishermen to make them aware. They've got a lot of gear out there already. We're putting together a map just to illustrate for the public how much gear is out there. So if these fish were out there in any number, we're pretty certain that these guys would run into them. So part of it is creating the awareness. We need to be extra vigilant, and then thinking about ways that we may start looking at those rivers, the Maumee River, the Sandusky River, the Ottawa River, more closely to evaluate if there might be a potential spawning population. And then if there are a number of different avenues that we can take to try and do control or eradication.
Okay, we can do our next audience question. All right, so again, this is just your opinion. What do you think is the most likely way that Asian carp could get into the Great Lakes? Number one is the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. Other inland waterways is number two. Number three is intentional release into the Great Lakes. 4 is accidental introduction, and 5 is other. All right, so everybody, mostly the majority thinks Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. So Carl, Denny, which one of you would like to talk about the most likely pathway that you see carp using to get into the lakes? We'll give Tammy a break.
Well, I think that's, obviously everybody here reads the paper, and certainly that's probably the largest vector. Think about intentional release and unintentional, maybe another one. There's a good trade on Asian carp, particularly in Asian communities in Toronto and in Canada. And Asian carp, even commercial caught Asian carp, aren't worth a whole lot of money. A few cents. Dead ones. Live ones are worth a lot of money. And that trade there goes into those communities in Canada, and some of the heritage of some Asian people is buy 2 live fish, eat one, and put it back in the lake. That certainly is a vector, and there's many, as well as the others that we've talked about, you know, the rivers that are crossing through in the flood. So Chicago, Ship Canal, I have to agree with the audience.
Would you like to weigh in, Carl?
Sure. Yeah, I think the Chicago Ship Canal for sure is one. I mean, so they have an electric barrier. It's going to help keep you know, the adults out, but it's certainly not foolproof. And then, but I think, you know, when you try to solve the problem, you have to really look at all those. You can't say if we fix the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal that would solve our problem. Clearly, with the accidental introductions, that could be a thing. There's the juvenile big head and silver carp sometimes get confused with gizzard shad, which is a native species, and sometimes gizzard shad are used for bait. So there's some concern that those could be unintentionally introduced through bait. And then, you know, I think it's just sort of public awareness. Also, I mean, there's always this chance, if you think about how zebra mussels have been spread to inland lakes, those are mostly all likely from boating. And you know, so sort of same sorts of things. More unlikely with the carp, but again, you know, if you have people taking bait from one lake to another and those sort of things, then you know, it could be an issue.
And the DNR is working on, at least in other states, is Michigan also looking at preventing confusion of bait fish?
Yes, we are. Bait fish are an issue. What I wanted to point out first of all is that there is a study that you can find if you Google online that's called the Binational Risk Assessment. And this study, it was a joint study between Canada and Great Lakes Fishery Commission signed on to it in the U.S. government. So what that study showed was that the largest, even in spite of the fact that the electric barrier is there, that Chicago area waterway provides the greatest risk for fish introduction, Asian carp introduction into the Great Lakes. And the study actually documents risk for these other types of vectors. And the bait fish introduction is one that is recognized, but it's also much lower in terms of risk than the Chicago area waterway. And that's because risk is a combination of you've got to get the fish in the water first, then they've got to survive, and then they've got to find one another to do the love thing. And so the probability of that happening from a single bait fish introduction is much lower than multiple fish making their way through the Chicago area waterway canal. There's a piece of paper that I have here. I'm very remiss in that I didn't bring our brochures, but we have a really nice brochure that tells you how to distinguish the difference between minnows that you may use for fishing and juvenile Asian carp. So please, if you're interested, just make sure I can read your address and I'll get those in the mail to you this week.
And Tammy, can you describe, when we're talking about the electric barrier, it's a system of barriers on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, and how that works and why it might not be effective against really tiny carp? I mean, if they can even swim up against the current?
So the Chicago River used to flow into Lake Michigan and now flows out of Lake Michigan and downstream. And these barriers are set up in a series. There's 2 permanent barriers now that they're not operated at the same time. One is set to come on when the other one prevents fish 6 inch or smaller from moving through there. So the barriers have been in place for a while, but that parameter is very troublesome, that the small fish were not precluded until that point in time. They've since turned up the cycling of the electricity in the barrier, and so now they know they are effective against those smaller fish. But the barrier is not infallible. They've lost electricity 3 times for 3 different reasons, and then there's been no power in the Chicago area waterway for different lengths of time. They got right on it and they got it turned on again, but the point is it's not an infallible system.
And on that note, too, there's been a number, 100 some, I believe I read, positive DNA hits. Some of those were above the barrier system, and there was one big head carp, I believe, that was caught in Lake Calumet, which is very close to Lake Michigan. So how likely is it that they could be in Lake Michigan?
So there is a probability or potential for those fish to be in Lake Michigan. But we've done a lot of testing. Michigan DNR started a couple of years ago doing the eDNA testing down around the southern part of the lake and in the St. Joe River, up into the Pawpaw River, eDNA testing, and we did not find any positive results there. So very sensitive tests, and we found no positive results. Wisconsin has since done testing and has not found any hits there either, so that's good news for us. And we have not had any reports of people observing what they think might be Asian carp out in Lake Michigan. So there is a probability, there's a potential there. Let me just put it at potential, but we don't believe that large numbers got through in the time frame of getting those barriers up.
I talked to Dwayne Chapman a couple weeks ago, and he's a leading carp expert in Missouri, been studying carp for a long time. And one of the things I asked him was, if a few fish are found, what does that mean, and at what point do we need to, what can we do in terms of that? But he also said to me, we shouldn't just give up the ghost if you find a couple of fish. So I'd like you all to weigh in on that in terms of, if we do start finding fish in the Great Lakes, Asian carp in the Great Lakes, I guess it comes back to the question of what do we do about it? Do you just keep making a really big push to try to keep them out if you find a few?
Yes, we have a plan. The state of Michigan has a plan. We have a plan. But the information changes and we need to adapt that plan almost continuously. So our plan is on our Fisheries Division website, and you can take a look at it. We have an update to it, which updates it with the most recent knowledge, and I have a feeling after this year's experiences we will be updating yet again. But Dwayne Chapman is absolutely correct, and we kind of view him as the godfather of all things Asian carp. A very smart man who's done a lot of research. We can't give up. The state of Michigan can't give up. It's not our job. Our job is to make sure that we protect that fishery. Now, resources available, and God willing, we will be there to do what we can to eradicate whatever fish may get in there. The eradication techniques right now are very coarse. We don't have a lot of tools available to us, and we're having, and then to add insult to injury, these fish are really good at avoiding nets. It's freaky. They are really good at avoiding traditional gear. So we're having, the state of Illinois is working with different types of gear right now to see if we can more effectively capture these fish. So we will still attempt to go out and eradicate the fish where we know where they are and where we have a reasonable likelihood of doing something meaningful. Activity just to do something, to say, hey, we're doing something, is not a good use of the stakeholders' dollars at this point. Now, the other thing that binational risk assessment says is that it only takes 10 females and 10 males to create a viable population in the Great Lakes. So we're looking at very low numbers of entry that could potentially start that type of invasion.
Either of you want to weigh in on that at all? In terms of what we should do if we find some fish?
I think Tammy pretty well had it in the head, so you can find that information on the website, and it's a work in progress. Let's just hope it doesn't. We don't have to get to that point, but you could. So now's the time to look at all avenues of prevention, which is going to be the best cure.
Okay, that brings us to our fourth question for all of you. All right, so this is what you think. What would you most like to see done to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes? Number one is physically separate the Great Lakes from the Mississippi River Basin. Number two, strengthen laws, and there are existing laws, as Tammy mentioned, prohibiting the transport of live carp. Three, continue the current measures, electric barriers and that kind of thing. Or four, develop markets to harvest carp in the Mississippi River Basin. Or, yeah, there's no all of the above. I'm making you choose one.
Most.
All right, so there's a lot of support for separating the basins. So, Carl, can you start about talking about how exactly that might work, or Tammy, whoever would like to talk about that?
Well, separating the basin, so the main thing would be looking at, putting some kind of physical barrier in the Chicago sanitary shifting out. Some of the concerns or the issues we'd have to deal with that are, one, commerce that moves through there, look at, how do you want to deal with that issue, so there would definitely be economic implications. And another economic implication is that flooding. So there's a lot of houses that would turn them into living in a floodplain. I don't know, not exactly clear on all the specifics of that, but I know that would be an issue. So if you separate that, all of a sudden, you can imagine if you were a homeowner, all of a sudden you start living in an area that has a very high probability of flooding, so that would be something else you'd have to deal with. Another issue with separating the basins is that there's multiple, so the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal is the most likely avenue, but there are some other avenues we'd also have to look at separating. In my opinion, I think that's sort of the way, though, that we need to move forward, and not just because of Asian carp, but I think that sort of having that opening that's not natural, irrespective of what you think about Asian carp, there's going to be other invasive species in the future, both stuff in Lake Michigan that might go into the Mississippi River Basin and vice versa. A good example of that is the snakehead. I don't know how many people have heard about snakehead. So from what I've heard, I was at a conference a couple years ago. They were talking about how snakehead had escaped from some Arkansas fish hatcheries, which should sound familiar. That's essentially how we think Asian carp got into the Mississippi River Basin. And at the talk that I heard, they had done a lot of effort to try to eradicate the snakehead, and so far it didn't look like they were successful. So I mean, in 20 years or 30 years from now, we could be sitting here having potentially the same argument about if the basins aren't separated, that snakehead could be the next one going on, and who knows? I mean, you can't foresee the future about invasive species. But I would also add that I think all of those things on that list are important. Prohibiting the live transport of fish is clearly important. In the interim, maintaining the electric barrier is critical. And then I think developing markets, if that's a way that we can try to reduce the amount of fish in the Illinois River, it's probably a good thing. Although I have heard some echo concerns that creating a market for Asian carp, you could in turn eventually create folks who want to see the carp continue with their livelihood is based on that. They don't want to see that end. So there are some folks who would say maybe we need to think more carefully about that.
There's a recent study and a presentation by St. Lawrence River and Great Lakes Cities Initiative, something like that, and the Great Lakes Commission. And you probably can get that online somewhere, Google up close to that. But for example, if you were to redo the Chicago area waterway system, and this is accommodating tour boats and barges and shipping coming in and lift them over berms and so forth, and preventing the carp. That's a huge project. There's 3 different degrees of how they can do it. I think the prices range somewhere between $7 billion and $11 billion. Pretty close to that. Pardon? 3.4 to 4.4. I've seen some higher ones there, and it would take 25 years or better to complete it. So obviously, too much, too late. I say you could say that, but that's one thought on it. And again, you still have the other door in the St. Lawrence Seaway system too. So as long as we have those 2 open, we'll be continually dealing with invasive species forever.
So the study that Danny's talking about is called Restoring the Divide, and it is online. Just Google it up. And it came up with 3 different options. One that was near the lake, which sort of made the biologists uncomfortable because it didn't give you any margin for error if fish were to get past those barriers. A mid-barrier proposal, and then one that was a single barrier further downstream. In the end, the mid-barrier location came up with a price tag of about $3.4 to $4.4 billion. So today's dollars. The interesting thing is that the original engineering project to reverse the flow of the Chicago River and do all that lock and dam work in there was also in today's dollars about $3 to $4 billion. So I find that number very interesting. But so you say, well, that's a whole lot of money. Well, there's a whole lot of people that live in the Great Lakes Basin that care about this issue. And if the Great Lakes Basin folks wanted to see this happen, it would come at a cost of about $11 per household for 50 years. The study would be, or the project itself would be done in 2029. If you say, okay, but this is sort of a Mississippi River Basin issue too, because we're going to prevent bad things from going down that river as well, that cost goes to $4 per household for the next 50 years. The important thing to understand is of that, $140 million is what is required to build the barriers. The rest of the money needs to be used to deal with Chicago sewage concerns, runoff and the flooding concerns, both huge concerns, and then the transport concerns in terms of getting commerce downstream. But there are ways to do this. And in that report, you see quotes from the mayor, Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, you see Pat Quinn, the Illinois governor, you see several different higher level politicians saying, this is a good idea to do this now. It will be good for the city of Chicago. It will be good for the Great Lakes. We'll have state-of-the-art infrastructure moving into the future, and we'll fix some things that we kind of already know we need to fix anyhow.
All right, thank you. We're going to move to our audience questions. So it's your turn to ask your questions. Steve is going to come around, I believe. Diane's going to come around with the microphone. So just raise your hand if you have a question. Diane will come to you.
It's on.
Thank you. So what are we learning from, if these Asian carp came from different parts of the world? Obviously, the U.S. is not, or the Great Lakes isn't the only location that's having this problem. So what are we learning from the other parts of the world that are having to deal with this?
Right now, the Mississippi, what happened was these fish were introduced from floods from down in the south with aquaculture ponds. They were introduced in the Mississippi Basin that way, and then have invaded upstream. They don't have those issues in other well, I'm going to take that back. There are other places where there's a large lake, I think it's in Turkey, where these fish were introduced. And people didn't think they would cause much harm, but they actually decimated the fishery in that large lake. So they're really, in places where these fish have been introduced, there haven't been any effective control measures developed. And they've just simply done their thing. But right now, the invasion pattern that's happening in the Mississippi Basin is the largest one that's been found.
And I would just add that it is sort of surprising how much of the basic life history of the fish that, still not clear on, that for whatever reason, there just hasn't been the grant dollars for folks to study it. Now that's all changing now because it's, getting much more attention. And then another problem is some of the places, where there has been some of the work done is in, China. So if literature is published in Chinese, there's translation issues, and I believe the folks who are, working on that are trying to deal with that, but it does make it more difficult.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. We already have two examples, the lamprey eel and the quagga mussels. Can you walk us through that history a bit so that we can see, how that evolved and what the results of that are? I think it helps us then look ahead to what this carp issue would be for us. Thank you.
So sea lamprey, it's presumed that they got in when they built the Welland Canal around the one that goes around Niagara Falls, right? Yeah. Then when they made that canal, that allowed sea lamprey to move up into the Great Lakes, and then so the sea lamprey were not native to Lake Michigan, and so when they eventually got here, they decimated lake trout populations. So I don't know how much you know about sea lamprey, but they attach to their sides. They're essentially a parasite, and they feed on the bodily fluids of the fish until it's dead, and then they go on to the next one. How long? So what, 1940s? Is that when they first got into Lake Erie, or was it earlier than that?
Almost all the Great Lakes.
Okay.
And by the late 40s, there was no more commercial fishing. Lake trout was originally a commercial caught fish, okay? And between overfishing had something to do with it also. But the sea lamprey, the Welland Canal, I think, was finished in the just before the turn of the last century, somewhere in that area right there. And then subsequently, the St. Lawrence Seaway opened up later. But once they could bypass the Niagara Falls, then they made themselves, into Erie and up to Huron and perfectly suitable streams like we see here along Michigan, Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And before you knew it, there was a huge population up there that were devouring all the lake trout. That was in so in the 50s. Give you a little bit of history. Maybe everybody knows this, but in around the late 50s, by a convention between Canada and the United States, formed the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and their primary purpose was to eradicate or control somewhat sea lamprey and develop TFM and some other chemicals, trapping, sterile melt programs, and looking at some other ways to control sea lamprey. And we're still in that process. Sure, we've controlled sea lamprey to the point that in the late 60s then, and enough sea lamprey control started to reintroduce lake trout. And then we had another invasive species show up, the alewife, that came through that same system and utilized Pacific salmon, finding Pacific salmon, create a fishery by the forage on the alewife. So, I mean, there's an invasive species that turned out sort of happy, but the whole lake, any of the lakes, will never be the same once all those have been introduced. And we'll always be dealing with that.
And so for quagga and zebra mussels, those were brought by transoceanic freighters. So those are from Eurasia, Caspian, Black Sea area. And so ballast water, so those ships come into the Great Lakes, they switch their ballast water Those were first found, I believe, in either Lake St. Clair or the St. Clair River. And within just a few years, those had spread throughout the entire Great Lakes.
Yeah, so the voice that's missing here is the commercial fisherman. Now, I write for the only commercial fishing magazine in the country. And it essentially all comes down to money. I mean, you got a charter boat and sport fishing industry that's based on an invasive species. Walleye, stock, salmon, stock in the Great Lakes. And it's, I also spoke with Dwayne Chapman for a story I just filed last month. And we were talking about the markets that are available. And the state of Illinois signed a 13 million pound contract with China to supply them with Asian carp, because the Chinese came over and were eating Asian carp, and they said, we got nothing like this in China. It was so good because obviously it's a new territory for the carp. So the deal that was cut between Illinois, a couple of private fish processors in Illinois and China, was for 13 million pounds of fish. That's a lot of fish, and it would reduce the pressure on the Sanitarian Ship Canal, which is, as we see here, the main, avenue for the Asian carp to get into the Great Lakes system. Now they haven't shipped one fish to China. Hopefully they'll start this fall. This is from a year ago, because again, it all comes down to money. They didn't have the ability to process that volume of fish in Illinois. They're working on it. They got grants. They're increasing the capacity. So there's some movement in that area. Essentially, the commercial guy is getting 10 cents a pound for fish. They ran a commercial fishing season, 3-week season, to keep the fish out of Lake Kaskaskia, which is the biggest inland lake in Illinois. And in 3 weeks, they took out, I think it was 60,000 pounds. One guy, 60,000 pounds, to 10 cents a pound. So the question is, if we develop another market, a new market. I mean, there's a little bit in the deli trade. They're shipping some to China. They're shipping some to the Asian communities, processing. If we can develop a market for the fish that would allow commercial fishermen to actually make a living. Some of them are fishing for the government now in Lake Calumet, even in upper Mississippi around Minneapolis. They're taking, with entanglement gear for surveying, for population density numbers and all that. But if you could have a market that would pay more than 10 or 15 or 20 cents a pound for this Asian carp, they could clean them out, essentially, of the river system, which is where the pressure is coming from at this point. Now, you scientists figure out if you can produce enough fish oil. Commercial fishermen are using straight fish oil to run their diesel engines. There's more BTUs in fish oil than there is in diesel fuel. Now, if we could get Asian carp to be a feedstock for that alternative fuel, then we might have a market.
All right, did anyone take that? Or Sammy?
I just want to comment that the commercial fishing, the contract commercial fishing that is being done right now in Illinois is a very important part of reducing what they call that propagule pressure. And so as the population density increases, as the invasion front moves forward towards the electric barriers, and now it's moving up into Minnesota, into the Twin Cities, it's moving over into the Ohio. The contract fishing is a very important aspect of reducing that pressure. Yes, they have the contracts with China. My understanding is processing is one issue. The other issue is that there might be issues with quality, not liking the frozen side of it, so I hope that plays out. But the other issue is the amount of mortality that you can put on any given population. So as fisheries managers, we manage on the basis of population dynamics. And if you're going to control a population or reduce a population, you need to know the level of mortality that needs to be incurred on that population in order to reduce their numbers, so they're declining rather than increasing. Recognize that we manage the lake whitefish fishery, commercial fishery in the Great Lakes with a targeted mortality level of about 65%. And that's a commercial fishery that just does just fine with 65% mortality. So the question becomes, when these fish are inhabiting all of these different little bayous and backwaters and tributaries, can commercial fishing effectively control the population by inducing a high mortality? And the studies right now are suggesting that probably can't do it all by commercial fishing alone, that there's going to have to be something else to achieve a high level of mortality to see that population decline rather than hold steady or increase. Fair enough? Frame where the egg is still viable and depositing the egg, and then that egg actually becoming a viable fish. So you start to add up what is the real probability of something like that happening, and it turns out that it's a very, very low probability. Not improbable, but certainly not the level of risk that something other than like the Chicago area waterway or bait fish transmission might do. So this is a game of managing the risk, and that's pretty much everything we do, whether it's food safety or health. You're managing risk, and nothing is 100% guaranteed. But our job is to make sure that we focus on those things that pose the greatest risk. And that's a good question. That's not a plot-away question. It's a good question.
And one thing I would add to that is it also sort of makes the case for prevention. And prevention not just for like having a barrier, but prevention that we should not allow folks to bring these kind of species to North America that don't belong here in the first place. And that, you know, sometimes you look at how we deal with invasive species, I sort of feel like sometimes we're just, you know, chasing sort of we have a losing battle. But the way to do it would have strong legislation that would keep removing species here, and it should be on the folks who want to bring a new species in. They should have to, you know, the burden of proof should be on them to prove that it's not going to have an impact here, not they bring it here and then we find out it's a disaster and they walk away and have, you know, no consequences.
You had a couple of questions in the back there? Okay.
While the carp appear to be too big for native predators when fully grown, is it a possibility to use biological control via predation when they're small, say at spawning sites?
What do you have in mind?
Back to it. Press the wrong button here.
Go ahead.
Is it working now? Okay. Well, there are some salmon are very aggressive to fry in rivers, and possibly at the mouth where the carp spawn. Planted predatory fish could reduce the numbers at the young stage via getting fried.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses on, and I thought you were the Sea Grant extension agent planting a trick question in the back there. You're not him. So.
No, I'm just a random biologist.
That's a great question. So that is a hypothesis that's been proposed biological. Well, we'll just look at biological control. And again, we have to look at the prolific nature of these fish, the actual numbers of young that they produce, and then the ability of those fish to grow very quickly on that predator deeply. And I don't know that anyone has modeled that particular situation. It would make a very interesting question to model, but the prevailing theory is that we probably couldn't have any predators eat our way out of the situation. One thing that I wanted to add we were talking earlier about eradication and getting rid of these fish and knocking them out. We have never eradicated a species once it's been introduced into the Great Lakes system.
That's all I need.
Right, I've got a lot of voice my kids tell me, so I can probably speak up.
Stand up.
So I'm hearing that you feel as though the funding is not adequate. And knowing that we can't continue to spend money that we don't have in this country, I'd like to know what are your proposed approaches to be able to figure out ways in which we can have use taxes to pay for these longer-term multi-billion-dollar projects, which I'm not in disagreement with. But we have to somehow figure out how we're going to fund this. I think an interesting poll that we could do on the screen would be to determine whether or not the audience would be interested in spending $100 a year on increasing taxes, $1,000, $10,000 for environmental concerns that we all know have to be addressed. But at what point are we willing to pay for it? So I guess the question I like to ask you, especially in the sports fishing industry, which, frankly, I gotta say, guys, are we paying the true cost, right, is the issue. I mean, we don't pay the true cost for our highways. We don't pay the true cost for environmental issues in this country. So how are we going to pay for the true cost, and who's going to pay for it, and what use taxes do you think need to go up to pay for these in order for us to truly eradicate this and to have a long-term viable Great Lakes Basin approach? We haven't even talked about the idea of addressing the issue of ballast water, which has been, we've known that for 30 years.
All right, so Denny, you want to take that?
That's a really great question.
Well, I want to hear the answer.
I wish I did. If I had the answer, I'd probably be in some high political office.
No, they don't have the answer.
That's right. Well, that's kind of where we're at. We've seen a lot of funding. We've seen the Great Lakes Regional Initiative funding, for one thing. We've seen in the past the Everglades restoration funding. It comes down to just how valuable everybody thinks it is. If you're willing to, if you put a dollar figure on it, everybody says, this is really a good idea. I would be willing to give X amount of dollars per year if you get everybody to agree to do that. Some people probably wouldn't. I don't know what the answer, long-term answer would that be. I tend to pose, and I just bringing this out, I don't know if I come to fruition, but I worked with a national outfit here not too long ago to pose this question to both presidential candidates. Right? What would you do in your next term of office in regards to enhancing and protecting the Great Lakes? There's 40 million people that get their drinking water from the Great Lakes. Billions of dollars around states in the tourism industry. Tourism is one of the third largest industries in our state, manufacturing and agriculture. What value is that tourism industry? What value, what would happen, and we talked about impacts a little bit earlier, there's 830,000 jobs that are directly related in Michigan to the Great Lakes. What kind of figure do we put on that? So it's got to come from high up, it's got to come from Congress. And I don't think there's anybody in Congress that would deny that the value of the Great Lakes, one of the world's most precious resources. It's how to do it and how to fund it becomes the issue, unfortunately. So I know I didn't answer your question because I don't have the answer to that one.
I'd like to know where these fish are endemic, and if they're so prolific, what are the management controls on their populations and how large?
So the question was where the fish are native and why, or what are the controls on their populations in their native habitat. So the fish, big-headed silver carp are essentially sort of China, and then I look at the distribution maps, the native range goes up maybe a little bit into North Korea, a little bit, maybe a little bit of Russia, but sort of that area is where they're native. From what, so I don't really have a good explanation to answer the next part of your question, other than I'll give you a more general answer, and that is oftentimes where species are native, there's an evolutionary history of those species, so they tend to not be problematic. And a good example of that is if we think about largemouth bass. So largemouth bass, for the most, we don't consider those a problem fish in Michigan, right? Well, those fish have been stocked in Japan, and in Japan they're a huge issue, and they're a problem, and they're trying to deal with how do they control largemouth bass because they're having negative effects on the native species. So oftentimes things that aren't a problem in their native range, when you move them to somewhere else, they become a problem. There's a whole host of hypotheses for why that is. things like, there's not the native predators there, so they can explode, that maybe they get away from their native diseases. The reason they establish is there's some niche in the ecosystem that isn't filled by a native species, and they're able to exploit that and take off. And in science, the one thing I've learned is rarely is it any single answer. It's probably a combination of all those and some other things that I didn't mention.
Okay, that's all the time we have for tonight. We'd like to thank the Great Lakes Fishery Trust for their financial support of tonight's event and also our on-air series last week. And we'd also like to thank the Kirby House for hosting our event tonight. And if you could give a big round of applause for our panelists.